apoplexys, odds, bleeding, fluxes, gripings, wind, shortness of breath, diseases of the breast and lungs, abortion, want of appetite, loss of the use of limbs, colic or bellyache, appositions, thrushes, quinsys, deafness, buboes, cachexia, stone brains, and stone bladder, with the preparation of the principionum, or universal medicine of Paracelsus, to which is added the philosophic works of Hermes Trismegistus, Cadupedicus, Gabriel Adams, Antesius Longueus, Nicholas Flamel, Roger Bacon, and George Ripley, all translated under the best 5 editions into English. Before we move on, I want to draw attention to 2 particular features of this text. At the left, we see an illustration of, is described as Geber's furnace, which is a distillation apparatus described to a gentleman named Abu Musa Jabir ibn Hayyan, usually known as Geber in the West, who was one of the foremost Arab polymaths and chemists of the Islamic Golden Age, someone who's active during the 1800s. So even here in the 1690s, we're still recognizing that our traditions of chemistry and practical physics are derived from the medical expertise of the Arabs. And we also have here on the right the errata page, which is a feature of early modern printing whereby a printer would acknowledge typesetting errors in finished work that were too late to correct. So I'm not going to go back and reset the entire edition. Here's a page just saying this should say that. I always get a kick out of seeing those. Now we move on to a considerably less whimsical book, which was acquired just this year. This is the title page from the 9th edition of a very influential book called the Disquisitionum Magicale Librisex, which we might render as kind of magical investigations or inquiries into magic. This is a stereotypically occult-looking book. It has clasps on the binding, but in fact it's almost an anti-occult work. Because you see, this is actually sort of a witch hunting manual. It was prepared by a priest who originally trained as a lawyer and represents a sort of a legal weaponization of the famous Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, a very famous and influential kind of anti-witchcraft text. This work contains an immense amount of textual exegesis. So going back and really analyzing what scripture and the ancients had to say about witchcraft and the occult, and what we would consider today to be the supernatural. And in fact, it was so scholarly in nature that was turned around against the book as a criticism. You know, people are like, well, we're here to torture vulnerable people and get back at our neighbors. You know, we don't want to hear what some ancient nerd thought about familiar spirits. In fact, it's actually now generally believed that Martin Del Rio, the author, never presided at, perhaps never even witnessed a real witchcraft trial. But in spite of this work went through numerous editions. This is the 9th, right? So 9 in less than a century. And it was extremely popular as a reference work. Here we're looking on the left at the censor's approbation from this book. This is a sort of a legal license from the church and the secular authorities to print and disseminate a work. Now, this edition was published long after the introduction of the so-called Pauline Index, better known as the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Banned Books, which originated in the mid-16th century. But even before the church developed a formal framework for proscribing literature during the Counter-Reformation, printers were still obliged to seek local political license in order to disseminate books through official channels. This system of privileges is what eventually evolved for good or ill into contemporary copyright. It has to be said, this is an extraordinarily unpleasant work. You know, it begins speaking of the difficult necessity of these treatises, which really testifies to the almost unbelievably reactionary religious attitudes of the time. The 16th century was the time of the Protestant Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the Council of Trent, and the 30 Years' War followed closely on its heels in the early 17th century. So while there was a lot of burgeoning intellectual attainment in this time period, there was also an extraordinary amount of violence, intercommunity conflict, and very widely shared contempt for human life. Significant swathes of the European continent became effectively depopulated during the 17th century, during the more brutal wars of religion. So this work needs to be kind of read in the context of the cultural milieu of its time. But now we'll move on and talk about the things that we're all here for, which are the real occult books from our collection. And we're going to start with a very small book called La Véritable Magie Noire, And we can see here that this book is given an imprint of having been printed at Che Garcia in Rome in 1750. Even a novice student of typography looking at this title page would tell you that this is not 18th century typography at all. This must be a 19th century work, so this is a kind of a false imprint here. And this was a sort of a late example of a trend in French book manufacture called the Bibliothèque Bleue, which is kind of analogous to the chapbook phenomenon in English literature. Printing small, cheap, easily portable works on subjects of wide public fascination. And so this work is sort of in that vein. It's quite small, it has quite a flimsy binding. It was published clearly in the early to mid-19th century, and it is a pocket grimoire. It's a distillation of one of the most famous and most influential of the late medieval grimoires, the so-called Greater Key of Solomon. It's a distillation of this text into modern French. It's said to have been written by King Solomon himself, although really the grimoire was probably composed in the 1300s or 1400s. And this particular recapitulation started appearing in the 18th century, a tribute to a mage pseudonymously named as Eero Grego. No idea who this is. The great thing about this book is not just that it is a recapitulation of the Greater Key of Solomon, one of the most famous grimoires. It's not just that it's portable and designed to be carried around. The great thing about this particular book and this particular artifact that makes it unique is that it is very heavily annotated by a contemporary occult practitioner. And so there are lots and lots of annotations, amendments, even corrections in the text, particularly involving comparison to the English translation promulgated by my brother Mathers in 1889. It's been translated several times since then, but Mathers' text was the kind of definitive edition for students working in English for a long period of time. And it begins with a wonderful section on kind of the preparatory work involved in magic. The consecration and dedication of magical instruments. So the wands and the swords and the pentacle and the cup. They kind of stock and trade with the ceremonial magician. How do you get these things? How do you obtain a wand? How is it made magically powerful? So here we have a series of rituals and symbols for consecrating and creating these tools, including sort of wonderful prayers and exhortations. So from this section on consecrating a sword, we see this conjuration: Je te conjure, épée, par ces trois saints noms, Agro, Abracadabra, Jéhovah, afin que dans chaque œuvre magique, tu me sois une forteresse et défense contre tous les ennemis visibles et invisibles, par le nom sans salé, qui est très puissant, et par ses autres noms, Kalos, 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 Adonai, Loé, Ok, O Emmanuel, première et très nouveau, sagesse, chemin, vie, vertu, chef, couche, parole, splendeur, lumière, soleil, fontaine, gloire, montagne, vigne, porte, pierre, bâton, prêtre, immortel, messie, épée, que tu présides dans toutes les affaires et dans celles qui sont contraires. Amen. Wonderful invocation there. Those of you who just turned to the frogs, I apologize. And then we move on and talk about the bulk of the text, which is a series of astrologically themed pentacles. Pentacles are sort of magical seals or symbols which are held by their very existence and portability to effect changes or influences in the outside world, particularly conferring advantage over demons and spirits with which a magician might like to interact. And the book contains most or all of the pentacles of the Great Key of Solomon. The interesting thing about these pentacles is that they disagree wildly from version to version. Translations into different languages will number the pentacles differently, they'll be designed differently, they might look very, very different from each other, they might get reversed around, and indeed some of the annotations in this text are just such corrections. After it says this is pentacle 5, or such and such a pentacle was actually already on page 200, you accidentally use the same woodcut, which I kind of get a kick out of. And so these proceed through a series of planetary associations, beginning with Saturn and its pentacles, moving on to these the Pentacles of Jupiter. These are the Pentacles of Mars. I'll draw your attention in particular to the image of the lower right. On the left of this two-page spread, you'll see this kind of fantastically bizarre-looking creature that looks like it has a beard and a lot of enthusiasm. Self-portrait? Anyway, and some kind of weird arms or whatever. When I first saw this, I hadn't looked at the Great Key of Solomon, and I was like, what is that even supposed to be? So I compared it to kind of like a more authoritative modern edition. It's a scorpion. And in more modern editions, the scorpion is like anatomically correct and really great. And this scorpion in this pentacle just looks like the artist was having an incredibly bad day and was goofing around. So I really get a kick out of that. At top left, you can actually see a correction. You see a tiny, what looks like what we refer to in English as a Star of David, with Hebrew letters in it, and actually Hebrew names if you look at it really closely. This is actually an annotation saying, such and such a pentacle is completely wrong. This is the actual right pentacle. Like, I don't even know what's going to happen to me if I use this pentacle that's in this text. So this is someone who's really got a practical interest in the occult. Then we move on and we look at the pentacles of the sun. In the lower right-hand corner, the leftmost of those four images depicts sort of God himself, again, in this text done in kind of a very cartoonish style. So these are the sun's pentacles, and we see at the top right image several additions from the annotator of this text, who is saying, look, you've actually got the inscription wrong, you've omitted something from the outside of the pentacle, and you've omitted some of its content as well. Presumably, if you're a ceremonial magician trying to command or control demons, you don't want to make errors in your pentacles, so getting it right is really, really important. We also have these beautiful pentacles of the moon, which are a little bit different in appearance from all of the other pentacles in the text. And lastly, we have the pentacles of Venus, and then the pentacles of Mercury. This is an interesting work. The text in many ways is actually better than the early translations into English. It's more comprehensive. It contains more of the original text. The pentagrams or the pentacles themselves, however, are quite crude and poorly done. And they appear to have been engraved by someone who does not actually have Hebrew themselves. So it's difficult to see what they're really trying to say much of the time. So here are some of the annotations from this work. He says of the seventh pentacle of the sun that this is the sixth pentacle of the moon in Westcott, and the 8 points are rather different. Somewhat peevishly, of the sixth lunar pentacle, the commentator says this is evidently wrong. It's the same as page 102. This definition is given as the fifth of Saturn in Westcott. And then in another one, he actually completely corrects it. He says this is all wrong. The names of the angels should be, and then he does a long list of Hebrew names that have been omitted from the text. So he's not very pleased with some of the, he or she, I should say, is not very pleased with some of the errors that are occurring in these texts. And now we're going to move on and speak about my favorite, I'm biased, but my favorite of the texts that we're going to talk about today. It's my favorite for a number of reasons. Not least that it's enormously influential to this day. This text is still one of the kind of bedrock sources for Western mysticism and contemporary movie. This is also a very recent acquisition. This is something that we acquired actually earlier this year. We're acquired this from a Canadian bookseller, All the Better. And what we are looking at here is a first edition of the complete 3 volumes printed together of Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. So being the occultist in the audience, this is doubtless a name you've heard of, a text that you've heard of. It is impossible to overstate the influence of this particular volume. It is a fairly standard quarto-ish sized book. The binding, I don't think it's the original binding that is roughly contemporary of the binding with paneled leather on it. It was published in 1533, we think, and we'll discuss that more in a moment. And it is a comprehensive synthesis and summary of occult knowledge at this kind of turning point of the early modern to modern period. So Agrippa was active in the early 16th century. I can't emphasize the influence of this book enough. This is a masterpiece, or apparently, as I've put it here, a masterpiece of early modern occult thought. It's actually first attempted in 1509, first attested in 1509 or 10. He dedicates a copy to a friend and benefactor of his, Johannes Hartemius, who's a bishop of Sponheim. So he gives this bishop an early copy of the work And this published copy diverges hugely from the original version, which means that he's been diligently amending and revising this text for a period of almost 20 years by the time that it's finally published. And the reason that one of the reasons this book is so significant is, remember that I said this kind of Western esoteric tradition really begins to coalesce during the early modern period, owing to a number of kind of societal forces that are all coming together at the same time in the Latin West. And this book takes place exactly.
Hey, thanks everybody that's here watching. I didn't think anybody would watch.
It begins with an approbation. Remember, we discussed these before. On the right, we see the approbation of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. This is an extremely unusual page, although it doesn't look like it. This is a book which was ostensibly published in Germany in the Latin language for a Latin reading audience. Why is the dedication, why is the approbation in French to Charles V? This has led some to speculate that perhaps this was published in Basel or somewhere slightly more within the orbit of the Francophone cultural sphere. I don't have the answer. I merely pointed out as a curiosity to the text. And we also see a dedication or a prefatory epistle to Hermann von Wied, who is a clergyman to whom this work is kind of being prefaced by letters saying, Reverend and most illustrated abbot or bishop, I present this humble and groveling work to you. I'm sure it's totally insufficient. There's kind of a formula of these documents which preface a lot of early modern books. Then we start getting into the good stuff. The heart of the first of the three books is a series of tables of correspondence. Remember I've said a few times, this kind of principle of association or correspondence is a huge theme in Western occultism. It is like, okay, the color blue corresponds to the planet of such and such, which is under the government of such and such a celestial intelligence, and is looked after by such and such an angel, it's antagonized by such and such a demon, and by sort of relating those things to one another symbologically, a practitioner can construct a ritual apparatus, or a theurgic or a thaumaturgic apparatus for effecting change in the inner or outer world. And so this book is a really valuable source of these kinds of tables of correspondence. It also has a fantastic section on one of my very favorite components of early modern and medieval occult practice, which is the art of geomancy, divination by earth, if you will. Geomancy is an example of a base 2 divinatory system. Base 2 divinatory systems are found throughout the world. Probably the most famous would be the I Ching, which has a series of trigrams formed by, again, binary values, either broken or unbroken lines, which combine into a total of 64 hexagrams. The system of geomancy is much more finite. It only has 4 binary points, which means that there are a total of 16 possible figures here. And geomancy is an incredible synthesis of kind of intuitive and intellectual magical practice. It originates in, actually in the Arabic magical milieu as the ilm al-raml, which is like the science of the sand, or the science of the dunes in a certain way. And the idea is that a practitioner is literally making a random number of dots, sometimes in a specially prepared tray of earth or just in the sand of the earth. You make a random number of dots, you make another random number of dots, you do that 4 times in line, one on top of the other. Then you count backwards to see if your random number was odd or even, and that tells you whether you assign 2 points or 1 point to that line of the figure. And in so doing, you end up with one of these 16 main figures, which has a kind of occult significance and divinatory significance. Then a kind of mathematical calculation enters in, where you usually generate what are called 4 mothers. So you have a question, and you generate 4 primary figures. And on those, you perform a series of basically arithmetic calculations to derive subsidiary figures called the nieces and the witnesses and judges and whatnot that give a whole lot more context to the question you're asking. And then these are sometimes superimposed onto an astrological house chart to draw that in. The reason I'm spending so long talking about geomancy isn't just that I love it and I think that it's extremely interesting. It's because while astrology is incredibly popular today, geomancy has become almost totally forgotten in public imagination. And this is kind of interesting. We see here a line from Dante's Purgatory where Dante describes, the geomancer sees his greater fortune ascend undimmed up the east. So in this work, the Divine Comedy, which is a work of popular literature, Dante, in his time, is so conversant in this sign system and takes it so much for granted that others are conversant in it, that he names one of the geomantic figures by name, expecting that a reader will know what it means, what its symbolism is, what its astrological associations are, and so on, which is quite interesting. And I will also point out another interesting feature of this particular chart, which is if we look in the left two columns, we see the figures and their names. We will see about halfway down, two figures next to each other, which are called acquisitio. They're both called acquisitio, which you could say means gain in Latin. The first one says gain comprehended internally, the second is gain comprehended externally. This is fascinating because this second figure is more traditionally referred to as amisio, loss. And the visual cue for students of geomancy for these two figures is that acquisitio represents an upright cup or an upright purse. And amisio represents an upside-down purse with presumably money falling out of it. But here the names are a little bit different, which I find very, very, very interesting. From there, we move on to derive various geomantic figures or sigils, which can be used in other magical works. And we also have a series of occult anatomies, so kind of mapping the geography and the geometry of the human body to astrological correspondences, to elemental correspondences, ideas that holding certain postures could convey occult results, not entirely unfamiliar to us probably. And so we have a series of these wonderful illustrations which kind of map occult cosmological phenomena on the human body and its posture. We also have several tables of planetary sigils, and this is a kind of an interesting way of generating an infinite number of occult systems based on a finite set of numbers within a grid. So you have a set of numbers or letters within a grid that are in a particular order that corresponds to a celestial force. And from those letters and the numbers associated with them, you can spell out words or names, again, within the context of a specific planet, to generate different sigils, which usually look like these kind of squiggly weird lines. Usually when you see one of these kind of squiggly weird lines in an occult text, that is where it's coming from. This book is also famous as a repository of occult notation, numerology, supposed Chaldean number systems, and obscurantist Hebrew number systems, and also for kind of occult alphabets. Alphabets to be used by practitioners in dedicating magical equipment or in writing magical texts or whatnot. Probably the keen eye among us will recognize that most of these, particularly this leftmost photo, which is showing us two of these magical alphabets, some of us might recognize that these letters derive quite transparently from Hebrew. These are effectively kind of variant crypto-Hebrew scripts for Western occult esoteric use. The book also contains talismans. This one is referred to as a sacred seal more efficacious against any diseases of man or any griefs whatsoever, in whose foresight are the four square names of God. And it goes on to describe exactly how this is to be made with a handy illustration in case you weren't following along with the text. And this is one of my favorite pages of the whole book because I saw it and I had a real aha moment. What he's referring to here are sigils that are generated mnemically by combining letter forms of a given name in a given alphabet. So he shows an example on the left of the Hebrew sigil, an example in the middle of a Greek sigil, and on the right we see an example of a Latin sigil. And what we're looking at here is the name of the archangel Michael, kind of intuitively derived into a sigil in these three alphabets. And the reason this made me go, aha, is that there was an entire branch of early 20th century occult practice by an occultist named Anton Osmond Spare that was exactly around this premise, a kind of intuitive generation of magical symbols using letter forms. The idea in his system being, I'm going to subliminalize a concept in my mind by taking something that makes sense and distilling it into a nonsensical glyph that can then work on my psyche at an intuitive level, what we're seeing is essentially a very early form of this same practice in 1533 in Agrippa. And then we see certain familiar motifs of sigils, which can be received by revelation only. And otherwise, the only way to get these sigils is to be gifted them by God or by divine revelation. And the last text we're going to talk about is the Livre Vision, or Book of Visions, which is, it's the book about which I know least. It is about the book about which I am least competent to speak, but it's certainly the most rare of the occult texts that we have in our position. As much as I love the Agrippa, and I think that it's wonderful, not just because Agrippa was also an archivist, and an archivist to royalty, no less. I love Agrippa, but it's a printed book, and it's not a very heavily annotated one, which means that it's a lot like a lot of other printed books of its same edition. Our copy of the Livre Vision is a manuscript, which means that it's inherently unique. And not only is it inherently unique, it is one of only 6 attested fragmentary manuscripts of the work for which it tests that are known in the entire world. And I'm going to begin with a quote by the scholar Claire Fanger, who did some work with our text in the 2000s, where she essentially says, this appears to be a Marian, almost devotional work. But what this really is a recapitulation of, or at the very least, a work in conversation with the medieval demonological tradition of the Ars Notoria. So whereas the purpose of the Livre Vision may be a synthesis with divine energies, it derives from magical systems which are really about communing with and commanding maleficent celestial energies. So kind of turning that on its head. The manuscript itself is comparatively late medieval. It is interesting because it's written on a mixture of both paper and vellum, which is significant in and of itself. It was written by, who knows? I don't know who the scribe of our manuscript was, but the author of the text was one Jean de Mauvigny, often called John the Monk, who flourished in the late 1200s and early 1300s. And what this manuscript is a distillation of a work called The Flowers of Heavenly Teaching, first written in Orléans in the early 1300s. And as I said, this repurposes the Ars Notoria within a kind of Marian framework. Not just a Marian framework. This book could only have been written at this time because it is clearly tied to the burgeoning emergence of the formal university movement within Western Europe. Because its core is a series of complex rituals, prayers, fasts, austerities to be undertaken with the explicit goal of academic excellence. The goal is the mastery of the 7 liberal arts, the quadrivium, and somewhat more controversially, the so-called accepted or forbidden arts, hydromancy, necromancy, divination, etc., in addition to rhetorical excellence or perfect memory. So you could say that this is a very, very complex and counterintuitive method of cheating, or it's a significant devotional, occult, magical, religious exercise. It's kind of a bit of both. But I find that really, really interesting that it is so intimately contextualized within this kind of intellectual milieu of a late medieval university or very proto-early modern university. And I just wanted to close with some close-ups of this text because it's extraordinarily beautiful. It's filled with kind of allegorically illuminations here, in almost all of which we see the motif of the flaming dove. The flaming dove usually points to manifestation of the Holy Spirit, or kind of divine spark of inspiration and will in the world. And it's significant that in almost all the illuminations, or many of the illuminations of this text, that the dove of the Holy Spirit appears, kind of analogous to what the magician is seeking to have happen to them by following these instructions. It's a very, very beautiful text. Rich allegorical symbological language informs its illuminations. But this is my favorite page, and this is the slide I will probably close on. This is my favorite page of the text, because what we're seeing here is a map of the exact conceptual universe that I was just talking about. This is a map of the quadrivium, the seven liberal arts, and under my caption...
I wonder if anybody's been having any crazy dreams lately. Ever since I stopped smoking weed, I've been dreaming like crazy.
Necromancy, etc. So in addition to these very kind of lofty academic purposes, we also have kind of practical or occult sciences being reflected in this ostensibly semi-devotional work. And I'm done talking about text. I'm going to emphasize just a couple of modern recantations of these works, or modern appearances of these works. This, of course, is from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. The 4th episode of the 4th season shows the mark of this ostensible demon. Clearly, this figure is derived from Goetic or Solomonic pentacles. The text itself, hilariously, is just a news story of a bustling being installed in Dublin. My Gaelic is not much decayed. I haven't looked at it in 20 years, but even I can tell that the first two words say there's bustling. So, well done to the prop department on that one. Transitutskuri, one of the occult alphabets I showed you on the slide a while ago, actually makes an appearance as still image here from the Blair Witch Project. So we're still borrowing from these texts to kind of add flavor to our media today. And last but not by no means least, probably the contemporary resonance of all of this that I'm most jazzed about. I want to share with you some art done by a prize-winning and very well-known Canadian author, who I'm fortunate enough to call a friend, who lives here in Hamilton, named Gary Barwin. And earlier this year, I was tweeting about having acquired the Agrippa and how excited I was about it, and I included an image of Agrippa's Angelica Celestial script. And Gary, who's also a visual artist, who does a lot of art around typography and punctuation, he was inspired by this alphabet to create a series of artworks, which he's still working on. And I love this sequence because it almost shows these letters being born from darkness into light. And so this is a kind of local and very modern resonance of this text in our local community, inspiring an artist. And I'm very grateful to Gary for his permission to share these with you today. So these texts and these motifs are still influencing our media, they're influencing our imaginations, and for occult practitioners, they're still influencing what we do in the shadows, as it were. And I think I will leave it there. Here's John Evelyn in sunglasses, and at this point I will thank you very much for your patience. I'm sorry to rush the content. I know we're about at time, but if anyone wants to stick around for 10 minutes or so, questions and discussion, I'd be very happy to engage in that. It would be great.
Thank you so much, Myron. This presentation is so wonderful. I learned a lot. And as someone who just watched the Blair Witch Project recently, I appreciate the gloss that came from the movie. It was awesome. So I think a number of people might have to take off, but we're going to stick around for another 10 minutes. If you have some questions, please do submit them in the Q&A function. But what I'm going to start with, in terms of asking Myron questions, is some of the pre-submitted questions from folks. So to begin, Myron, someone asked, will we be able to see these books in person, or will they be available to view in the library?
Extreme yes. Yes, we are proud to be open to public at the way we're proud to, our self-conception is that we look at, these are mere artifacts. Right? They're important, they're significant, they derive from great antiquity, but they're artifacts, in most cases, whose content has long since passed into the public domain. That means we are merely the guardians of their containers. The content belongs to humankind. So, yes, these will be available for consultation in our reading room. Some of them are so easily acquired they haven't been cataloged yet. But as we begin to walk back some of the restrictions that we necessarily needed to follow to keep everyone healthy and safe during the pandemic, it's our hope that we're going to have a lot more openness available from next semester onward for people that want to come in and see these in person. So yes, and I would definitely invite anyone who's interested to come on in.
Great. The second question that was submitted is, what are your thoughts on the fourth book of occult philosophy attributed to you, Agrippa? Is it authentic or pseudepigraphical?
It's totally fake. There is no justification whatsoever for attributing that to Agrippa, except that it was done when it was published. His own students at the time, one of his own students actually said, there's no way my teacher wrote this. It's not style. He didn't write like this. And content.
Holiday flavors are back at Wawa, like peppermint mocha, eggnog, and vanilla sugar cookie. Available in your favorite handcrafted beverages, smoothies and milkshakes.
It's finally the spooky season again, and here at Let's Talk Religion we celebrate, as always, by talking about some of the darker aspects and corners of religion. Today we will begin a series of episodes on occultism, specifically as it has manifested in the Islamic world throughout history. From the alchemical writings of Jabir ibn Hayyan or Geber, through to the esoteric writings of various Shiite thinkers.
I was just changing the lecture to Islamic occult sciences and getting some coffee.
There is a vast history and vast literature on this topic, and the occult sciences is something that has flourished in the Islamic world throughout history. So let's dive into this world of talismans, magical healing bowls, and alchemy in this introduction to the Islamic occult sciences. Okay, so there are a few things we need to get out of the way first. Firstly, the occult sciences or magic in the Islamic world is
When I paint, I don't really like to listen to music or anything. I like to listen to lectures.
little research, if any at all, done on this topic.
I don't know why.
It's even today still a hugely understudied field in that regard. If we look at academia in Europe or North America, the subject of Western esotericism is a by now hugely significant and well-respected academic field, but the same can definitely not be said for the Islamic occult sciences or Islamic esotericism or whatever you want to call it. This trend has started to change.
Over here is
groundbreaking research
the celestial language that I saw actually in a DMT strip. So it's a dome made of jewels, and these are the circuit boards, or the circuit board entities.
What we call the occult was simply a part of the larger category of science to most people in history. As Kursky argues, the categories of science, magic, and religion have become kind of forcibly separated by a post-Enlightenment paradigm, a separation that did not exist previously in history. Even a central and relatively recent figure in the modern category of quote-unquote science, like Isaac Newton, was very famously into things like alchemy. But this division between categories is very pervasive today and often in a kind of hierarchical order. Science is at the top, religion somewhere in the middle, and magic at the very bottom, being something embarrassing, irrational, and superstitious, far removed from anything resembling the mighty science. Going forward, we should do our best to get rid of any such distinctions or ideas in our head, not only because it's very healthy to always realize that our particular worldview and the way we categorize these things into different topics is very much based on a particular ideology that we have been brought up into and that shapes the way we look at the world and these different concepts, but primarily and most importantly,
Yep, we are in a feedback loop.
The people who we will be talking about ever made such distinctions. So what are these topics that we are discussing? What is the occult sciences or occultism? Well, according to a kind of academic definition, and we are notoriously terrible at defining things, when we talk about the occult, we are referring to things including, but not limited to, astrology, alchemy, ceremonial magic, divination, numerology, dream interpretation, talismans, and other related topics. Did or does these things exist in the Islamic world? Anyone who has a basic grasp of this topic and its history will know that it definitely did. But it can indeed be sometimes a controversial topic. I'm sure many of you are thinking right now, hold on, Philip, doesn't Islam forbid magic? Well, it's complicated. When we talk about these
Most of the
topics,
Islam, oh, it's not really Islamic, but a lot of it's pre-Islamic, ancient tribal magic. A lot of people in my family practice.
Sciences, or also an ulum al-ghariba, meaning something like the unusual or the strange sciences. As we saw, this wider topic also includes categories like magic, a word that is really annoying for scholars since it carries a lot of negative weights and is, surprise, surprise, really difficult to define properly. In a very simplistic way, we can say that magic is the process of affecting the world around us in hidden or superhuman ways, or taking advantage of superhuman powers to affect the world around us. The closest Arabic equivalent to quote-unquote magic is the word sihr. And sihr also has very negative associations in the Islamic world, especially today. Translating sihr simply as magic involves a lot of problems, however, as the Arabic term could be used in many different ways by different people. Many, if not most, perhaps Islamic scholars today would claim that sihr or magic, perhaps better translated as sorcery, is absolutely forbidden in Islam. But in fact, this was not necessarily always the case. Now, this can be a very controversial topic. There are differences of opinion on the legal status of quote-unquote magic and related topics in the Islamic world. Many will point to famous medieval writers like Ibn Khaldun, or Ibn Taymiyyah, and even Al-Ghazali as being against such practices, thus representing some kind of consensus among scholars. Others point out that
If you hear tippy tapping, that's my dog being crazy, going all over the place,
most people, well,
tapping her
they
feet,
agree
going
with
up and down the
that. And even
stairs.
in the case of those writers, they were
She
only
does that from when she
certain
wakes
occult
up
sciences
till
like
she goes to sleep.
astrology,
It's kind of
and not
annoying.
necessarily others, like dream interpretation, for example. Now, don't get me wrong, there are definitely forms of magic that were universally considered wrong by Islamic scholars. The argument, rather, is that many people make a distinction between permitted magic, sihr halal, the kind that invoked God or his angels or his different powers related to him, and impermissible magic, on the other hand, sihr haram, which might, for example, invoke jinn or other non-God forces. Indeed, the medieval lexicographer Ibn Manzur wrote in his Lisan al-Arab that magic was the process of, quote, turning something into other than its proper state, and which thus included, quote, everything from intercourse with the demons and enchantment to the power of poetry and eloquence, in other words, licit magic, sihr halal. This clearly gives us a broader definition of the word sihr, which can include things both good and bad, both licit and illicit. We will see examples of how this works later. Emily Savage Smith confirms, quote, sihr, for example, could apply to anything wondrous, including elegant and subtle poetry, to sleight of hand tricks, to the healing properties of plants, to invocations to God for assistance, to invocations to jinn or demons or the spirits of planets, and on occasion even to the divinatory art of astrology. Even medieval authors had their own definitions and subcategories. Magic seeks to alter the course of events, usually by calling upon a superhuman force, most often God or one of his intercessors, while divination attempts to predict future events or gain information about things unseen, but not necessarily to alter them. And when it comes to the occult sciences more broadly, figures like Miskawiyah and indeed famous philosophers like Al-Kindi considered things like astrology to be part of the natural sciences. So it's not necessarily true that all these occult sciences were seen as such by these medieval thinkers. Indeed, most of these things were seen as part of the rational natural sciences or rational philosophy in that sense. The question of whether or not these practices are allowed in Islam is a very complex topic, and I'm not really in a position to answer that question. I am not an Islamic scholar, I'm not a mufti, and I will leave that discussion to people who are more has the authority to actually speak on it. This is also the reasoning behind the title of this video, Introduction to the Islamicate Occult Sciences. I chose to use the word Islamicate rather than Islamic to highlight that these are practices taking place in an environment dominated by Islamic religious and cultural paradigms and political rule, without thus necessarily claiming that they are Islamic, as in connected to the religion of Islam or being religious per se. As for the occult sciences, rather than a word like occultism, for example, I follow the reasoning of Liana Saif in arguing that on the one hand, occult sciences actually is a more direct translation of the terms that were used by many of these scholars, like Ulum al-Khafiyya, for example, but also that this avoids direct associations with occultism as it came to be manifested particularly in late 19th century Europe, for example, when there was this mass movement of occultism. To the question if these things are allowed in Islam is not really the answer. I mean, that can be more authorized to talk about it. What we are interested in here, what matters for our discussion, is around the question, well, did the occult or magical sciences exist in the Islamic world, and do they still? And the answer is definitely yes, it did, and it does. The reason that there has been so little research done on this topic, and that there's a kind of denial about its very existence, goes back to, at least partly, to colonialism and Orientalism. The colonialists and Orientalist scholars of the past would often point to the widespread practice of occult sciences in the Islamic world as a sign of their backwardness and primitiveness, thus contrasting it to the enlightened and rational West. This resulted in a counter-reaction from two directions. Later scholars who wished to undo these questionable depictions started to emphasize other aspects of the Islamic world, instead highlighting quote-unquote rational figures like Ibn Khaldun, who represented the opposite side of the debate. And the same kind of reaction happened in the Muslim community itself. There was an attempt to distance oneself from all practices considered occult, magical, or irrational according to modern Western standards. We see this in the many reform movements in the Islamic world, for example. So this is what has resulted in the contemporary situation where the presence of magic and the occult in the Islamic world is often denied by many Muslim scholars and ignored by academia in the West. But indeed, when we look at history, we see an ocean of such sciences being practiced and written about. It's everywhere. And neither is it some folk practice only associated with uneducated peasants or regular folk. The occult sciences were something that the very people at the top, people like great scholars, philosophers, Sufi saints, scientists, and sultans, were involved with. And as we saw earlier, many of these people considered many of these things that we see as occult sciences as part of the rational endeavor of science or philosophy in a more general sense. So let's jump right in then. What were the occult sciences in the Islamic world, and who was involved with them? We find examples of such ideas and practices from the earliest periods. Of course, most of them existed since antiquity. They had been a part of the culture in the Middle East and North Africa and Central Asia and many other regions since long before the life of the Prophet Muhammad, but the arrival and spread of the religion of Islam, of course, affected very greatly the way that these sciences functioned. The Arabs themselves in the pre-Islamic period had partaken in certain occult sciences or magical practices, perhaps most notably the unique to them cultural practice of what they called ilm al-ramal, which literally means the science of sand. More commonly, the word used is geomancy, in which one would draw in the sand to predict things in the future as a kind of divination. They were also, just like many other peoples in what became the Islamic world in the Middle East and beyond, also involved with practices like astrology, alchemy, and other various forms of quote-unquote magic. Now, some magical practices appear to be, and were certainly interpreted as being, condemned by the Quran itself. For example, in Surah Al-Falaq, one of the shorter surahs in the Quran, it says that I seek refuge from those who blow into knots, essentially, which most interpret as referring to some kind of magic that was practiced in pre-Islamic Arabia. But many also interpret this as only condemning certain practices that were directly related to paganism, so pre-Islamic paganism, or other practices that in some way invoked forces other than God, the monotheistic God, some other deities, for example. In other words, with the spread of Islam, we don't see
A lot of the Islamic occult sciences was also influenced by Egypt.
In this kind of activity. The Muslims adopted a lot of the practices of the cultures that were conquered and surrounding regions. For example, Hermeticism became quite popular, a influence that may trace to the so-called star worshippers, a very mysterious group that apparently lived in the city of Haran in modern southern Turkey. which are also sometimes identified as the Sabians that the Quran mentions. However, these practices changed and adapted to the new Islamic theology. Certain practices, like animal sacrifice, for example, seems to have been basically entirely abandoned in the post-Islamic period, while others were simply reframed according to a new Islamic paradigm. What this meant was that all
I remember growing up,
all magical invocations,
one of my
all the
first
powers
memories as a
that
child
were
was
various things were
um,
from God,
during
sometimes
Eid,
angels or
we had
intercessors.
goats, two
This made
goats
them
in
halal or permitted. One
the
simply
courtyard,
asks
and I
for
thought
help
they
from
were
God,
my
which
pets,
doesn't make it all
but
that
they were
different
actually a
from any other
sacrifice.
prayer.
And
While
I didn't
most
know
languages,
this,
for the most
but
part,
this
were
was still going
invocations
on
of
in my
magic
family
forces
in
other
my
than
hometown in
God,
Pakistan
such
when
as
I was a
other
kid.
deities or jinn, for example. Now, of course, there were still people who did practice magic involving
And you
things
would
like jinn, as we'll see. But ideally,
sacrifice
this was
2
avoided
goats
and
and
was
share it
firmly
with the whole
condemned
entire
by the
village,
Islamic
and it would
clergy.
protect you.
The way this worked, we can see, for example, in various objects that were used in talismanic magic, objects that were used for protection against various evils. One could have an amulet, for example, that would be covered with names of God in Arabic.
Yeah, I
or
actually have
verses
a
from the
few of those
Quran,
amulets.
magic squares, and other symbols or seals that were thought to invoke the powers of God for protection. This is still quite widespread today, and we can often find things like the hand of Fatima or other similar objects imbued with protective powers. And this is what differs a lot of occult or magical practices in the Islamic world versus the pre-Islamic or non-Islamic contexts. That one almost exclusively invokes God or his power through intercession rather than other hidden forces, which is also why it might be a little problematic to translate seher as magic, because magic in our sort of Western European context usually means things involving forces other than God, whereas in the Islamic world, it was quite the opposite. Another famous occult science that, in a way, also has strong connections to an Islamic religious paradigm is alchemy. Indeed, while alchemy existed before the Prophet Muhammad, being developed primarily in Egypt by people like Zosimus of Panopolis, it was really fully developed into a proper scientific field and reached new heights in the Islamic world. Indeed, the word alchemy itself actually comes from the Arabic term alchemia, although the word chemia probably originates from Greek, and the phrase means something like the process of transmutation, to simplify it. One of the most significant figures in the history of alchemy is the mysterious early Muslim Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in Latinized form as Geber. He's attributed with writing the so-called Jabirian corpus, a massive collection of alchemical writings, which is said to have included around 600 Arabic works. Now, it is doubted by scholarship whether or not all of these writings, if any of them, can actually be attributed to Jabir ibn Hayyan himself. Many even doubt the very existence of Jabir himself as a historical person, including near contemporary Muslim scholars in the Middle Ages. But the existence of the corpus and the idea of the figure of Jabir ibn Hayyan shows that alchemy was a science that was taken very seriously by many at that time. Assuming he existed, Jabir's identity is also debated. It seems that he was born in Persia, but that he ultimately came from an Arabic tribal background. In terms of religious affiliation, most assume he was a Shiite, because indeed, very significantly, he often mentions Jafar as-Sadiq, the 6th Shiite Imam, as his teacher and as the person who has taught him all the esoteric secrets. And this is a very important and interesting point, that the Shia Imams were often seen as the source of all esoteric knowledge and sciences in the Islamic world. Jafar as-Sadiq, in particular, stands as a central figure in this regard, and is held in high esteem as a teacher by both Shiites and Sunnis, albeit for different reasons. It's not just alchemy that is associated with the Shia Imams, but all kinds of esotericism and occultism related to religious practice and beyond. But alchemy remained an important science during the Middle Ages and into the modern world, and would indeed lay some of the groundwork and lead to the modern field of chemistry. Alchemy was, and has always been, primarily a physical, natural science. It is the process of transmuting or transforming natural substances most famously of turning base metals into gold or creating the philosopher's stone, for example. But alchemy sometimes also took on more psychological, symbolic, and spiritual meanings. One of the earliest and most important proto-Sufis, or Muslim mystics/renunciants, the Ulun al-Misri, is said to have been an accomplished alchemist. Of course he was, since he was from Egypt, and a lot of the basic Sufi terminology and ideas came to use alchemical language, such as purifying the heart, for example, thus turning a soul that is coarse into a purified gold. This is very alchemical language, and this shows up much later in the writings of people like Ibn Arabi, as well as Al-Ghazali and beyond. Strongly related to alchemy is, of course, also astrology. This was the most popular form of divination in the Islamic world. Like most of the world at that point, the Islamic thinkers believed that the stars and different heavenly bodies that one could see in the night sky had a direct influence on the world and on human beings, our lives, and the things around us. The planets, the heavenly bodies, the stars, as they were known, planet literally means wandering stars, so they were all seen as stars in some way, but it was thought that these stars could be used to not only to look into past events, present events, but also to predict future events, and also to be employed in various ways practically, which we will see soon. The Arabic Muslim philosopher Al-Kindi famously developed the idea of stellar rays as a theory for how magic works in general. In his treatise on rays, or on the stellar rays, which sadly only survives in Latin translation, Al-Kindi explains how the stars act as kind of radiators that send rays from the platonic world of forms. These invisible rays and the almost musical harmony between them is what determines reality as we know it. Everything emits and interacts with these stellar rays, which act as the causal factor behind every effect in the world. Furthermore, this means that the person who understands how these rays work can not only grasp fundamental aspects of how reality works, but also, to some degree, to manipulate it. Through various means, one can control these rays that exist all around us, and through that also affect the physical world, and thus we have achieved magic. All forms of magic can be explained in this way, according to Al-Kindi, through these stellar rays. And one can influence these rays in various different ways, including simply by uttering certain words or phrases, like incantations and indeed even prayers. Prayers, according to Al-Kindi, work in the same way. These rays themselves and the heavenly bodies from which they come were, of course, thought in themselves to be controlled by God, who always remains the absolute power in the universe. But astrology as a science was indeed always one of the most controversial of these so-called sciences. When we look at critical writers like Al-Ghazali or Ibn Khaldun, who criticized certain occult sciences, it was usually primarily astrology that they criticized, because indeed it can be interpreted that when they talk about the heavenly bodies and their influence on the world and using these heavenly bodies and their powers to influence things, this can be interpreted to mean that we are using powers other than God to do our will, and thus we are doing something that is not permitted. Whereas for these actual scientists like Al-Kindi and so on, when we're using the powers of the stars, we are actually using the power of God, or through a kind of through intercession, in this case, by the heavenly bodies. God, as I said, always remains the absolute and ultimate power, at least according to these practitioners themselves, but the critics had a different view of this. So astrology has always been one of those most controversial of occult sciences. In any case, astrology itself continued to be a significant field after this, and still is today, as most of you know. I'm sure most of us have seen someone who wants to read our fortune or interpret who we are or our personality based on some sign that we were born under, for example. These are widespread practices even to this day. Aside from gigantic figures like Al-Kindi, we find other peoples like Abu Mashab, and the theories of these early figures, including about the stellar rays, remain central features of the esoteric and philosophical developments in later periods. In some of the central and famous books of occult sciences, like the Picatrix or the Shams al-Ma'arif, we find clear influences from people like Al-Kindi. And recent studies by Liana Saif has also demonstrated how they have been hugely influential for modern occultism and Western esotericism as well. The way people today sometimes talk about energies around us that influence the world has direct parallels to the rays of Al-Kindi, for example. Hermeticism continues
When I'm
to be influential
painting,
in the Islamic world
usually
as well.
I'm laying the darkest color down, so it's going to be the black, and then the dark green, and then the lightest color on top, so it could really pop. So just a tip for anybody that wants to start oil painting: don't dilute your oils with a lot of
including the ones already
oil.
mentioned, but also in the case of Ibn
I'm
Sina,
gonna go look
for
for
example,
it.
through things like herbal medicine. Even this fits into this category of occult sciences. You can see in his Ashifa or other writings how he talks about using different herbs or plants to cure illnesses or other ailments. Fasting stuff that is very much still in use today. There's nothing
I use this stuff right here. This is completely non-toxic. So if you guys want to paint without dyeing, I would use walnut oil, completely non-toxic, and you could use this indoors. And what I do is put a drop or two per 1 square inch of oil paint. Try to use as little as possible. And I build the color from dark to light. And that's how I paint.
To magic or sihr. There was never any question of whether or not magic worked or existed. Of course it did. The relevant questions were,
if you guys want to check this out, it's super cheap. It's completely like non-toxic. You can breathe it in, you can paint indoors, and I mean, I've been using this since I first started and it rocks. I don't like using oil thinners and toxic stuff because I paint indoors.
One of the most significant books of occult and magic sciences appear. One of the most famous grimoires, certainly in the Islamic world, but in the world generally, is written at this time, which is known as the Ghayat al-Hakim, which means the goal of the stage. This is a kind of syncretic work of magic and astrology, which became very influential, not just in the Islamic world, but also in Europe, where it became more famously known as the Picatrix. There's so much fascinating stuff to talk about when it comes to this topic. Magical seals, the staff of Moses as a magical object, magical healing bowls, the seal of Solomon, other talismans. By the 12th century, if not before, occult sciences and certain forms of quote-unquote magic had become mainstream. It was widespread and an aspect of daily life that was taken for granted.
I saw DMT Infinities here. What's up? I can't really see anything because I'm painting, so just want to thank everybody that's here.
Another one of the most famous, significant, and indeed controversial works of occult science in the Middle Ages is the so-called Shams al-Ma'arif, or the Sun of Knowledge, attributed to the Egyptian Sufi personality Ahmed al-Buni. This work is really a work of Sufism and dhikr, the invocation of God's names, which leans heavily into the occult aspects. This includes how to make protective talismans using God's names and other seals, but also involves discussions about jinn magic and other things. Very fascinating stuff indeed, but also, as I said, very controversial. This book is sometimes considered to be almost cursed by some Muslims, and that even owning a copy will bring you great misfortunes. By contrast, some Sufi orders still use it as an important work of spiritual instruction, and has become perhaps the most important occult work or grimoire in the Islamic world since then. The Ghayat al-Hakim, or Picatrix, became very famous and influential in Europe primarily, whereas the Shams al-Ma'arif, attributed to al-Buni, has probably been the most influential and famous such work in the Islamic world in itself.
I actually
And
have
at
a
the same
book.
time as
It's
Abu,
very hard to
we have the
read.
greatest sheikh, or Sheikh al-Akbar ibn Arabi, who in his writings like the Futuhat al-Makkiyah employs various occult sciences symbolically, including astrological speculation and its alchemical connections, as well as, much like Ahmed al-Buni in the Shams al-Ma'arif, the ideas of ilm al-huruf, or the science of letters. Especially around the 13th century, this became a very significant topic and subject. The science of letters proposes, to simplify a bit, that the letters of the Arabic alphabet have powers in themselves that can be utilized. Indeed, Ibn Arabi begins his massive compendium called Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, or the Mecca Revelations, with a discussion on the science and secrets of letters, the different associations with lunar mansions, planets, and other heavenly bodies. This is also a good example to show how intertwined a lot of these occult sciences were. Even something like the science of letters were deeply connected to astrology, which in itself is connected to alchemy. So all these topics are seen as parts of a single thing. To Ibn Arabi, creation is essentially the speech of God. It is the nafas al-Rahman, the breath of the All-Merciful, exclaimed in the originating command kun, or be, as in the Quranic kun fayakun, be and it is. In a very real sense, to Ibn Arabi, God creates the world through words. Everything in the world is made up of words and their constituting letters. And the actual letters of the Arabic alphabet are like visual representations or symbols of these essential letters of which creation is made. This means that they have powers to affect us, like when we recite names of God, letter combinations that are indeed very powerful. And this stuff wasn't unique to Ibn Arabi. Even outside of an Islamic religious framework, we see similar ideas flourishing in other traditions, such as in Kabbalah or Jewish mysticism. Contemporary figures like Abraham Abulafia view the Hebrew alphabet in a very similar way. And the already mentioned Shams al-Ma'arif also talks very significantly about the science of letters. As you can tell, there's a lot to go through here. There's so much fascinating stuff. And you probably noticed that in this episode I've only touched very briefly on each topic. This is because I plan to do separate episodes for many of these subjects, from talisman magic to the bigger tricks and the Shams al-Ma'arif in themselves. In this episode, I've instead given you a general introduction to this topic, an overview which will prepare us to later dive deeper into these separate topics in future episodes. So I'll see you then.
If you or someone you know is suffering from addiction, call 1-800-662-HELP.
Alright, welcome back everybody. I think I'm going to start, as we're just about at 2 o'clock. I appreciate it's very warm in here, so I won't be there with you to move out and get some fresh air, get a drink or whatever, and then hopefully we'll back afterwards. I might be able to set up to see something. So my name's Mark Anderson, and I'm really excited to see so many people here for this weekend. I don't know how many people need the whole weekend, or it's started today, it's this afternoon. In any case, it's fantastic.
This one's an anthology of ritual magic and occult philosophy by Oxford. If anybody wants to look that up later.
My own relationship with the department, we went for about 20 years now. My first their postgraduate diplomas in professional archaeology, and that belongs to a master's in the same topic. Some fantastic jobs in archaeology and a PhD in South Africa in archaeology and anthropology. So it's definitely a really valuable way in for people coming from all different walks of life, backgrounds, different educational and academic experiences. So if it's your first time, first engagement with the department, welcome. I really encourage you to explore the wealth of courses and opportunities that they offer. And if you're regulars, if you've been coming to us some time and not ever need to sell the department's offerings to you, you'll be quite familiar with how much fun they are. Very useful and enjoyable as well. So we're going to start exploring what is quite a massive topic today. And my goal really was thinking about how do I approach this, how do I give you a glimpse in 45 minutes or so into such an incredible realm of research and study. And I realised the best place for me to start is simply to talk about some of the things that I find most exciting and fascinating about this whole concept of religion, ritual practice, the supernatural, because these are things, these are concepts, these are realities that have been of critical importance for all of us as a species, or as far back as we can see. Okay. So, massive topic, we're going to dig into a few bits and pieces and essentially dip our toes in the water and some of the key, what for me are flashpoints of insight into this exciting experience. Now let's have a quick show of hands, if you don't mind. Who here has had any prior contact with anthropology as a discipline, any aspect of anthropology? Good. Okay, so that's probably about half, I would say, almost half. What about cultural anthropology specifically? Good, excellent. Well, for those of us who are perhaps new to this discipline, and know you come here to study a whole range of subjects.
This piece alone has taken around 100 minutes to complete, and that's just one. There's another one right there. So this piece is going to take, I'd say, at least 6 months to paint.
Excellent. And so the theologists who are already becoming focused in things, and usually will be exploring aspects of their own belief system. The anthropologist is very much taking a step back from that, saying, actually, it's not my job to even decide what is true or not. Okay? So I suppose it's an invitation at this stage that for all of us to put our anthropologist hats on and take a step back, perhaps from our own belief systems, whatever they might be, and start to approach this from very much a cross-cultural perspective to try and understand how people from around the world approach this realm of human existence and what it means for them. So if we started to explore more high-level definition of anthropology as a discipline, I really like this one as a start, which is the study of humankind everywhere throughout time. Which is pretty much covers all of the social sciences and all of the humanities and almost everything in between as well. So we're starting to narrow it down a little bit and start focusing on cultural anthropology as one of the sub-disciplines of anthropology. We can start to crystallise a bit more of a more focused definition. So anthropology seeks to produce reliable knowledge about people and their behaviour, whatever we mean by reliable, and how reliable any knowledge about human race can really be in terms of behaviours and beliefs. We're asking big questions like what makes people different and what do they share in common. And importantly, a core philosophy, certainly from my perspective, and many ways of approaching anthropology, I like to study.
Painting is very meditative.
So kind of like, not so much emphasizing the comparative element, trying to find similarities.
I could just zone out if I get in the mood.
And learning from them course, that involves studying ways of life in societies and across cultural contexts.
Also, I think the longer I've been painting,
And when we're thinking about
the more I've wanted to paint because I've become a cleaner painter. So when I first started, my whole apartment was a mess. Now I like to clean my brushes. Again, with this non-toxic walnut oil. And I do it in a way where I don't make a mess because I feel that the thing that stops me from painting a lot of the times is the messiness. So as long as I tidy up and clean every single brush as soon as I use it, I'll continue. Painting doesn't have to be as messy as it seems to be.
keeping an open mind and allowing cultures and practices to speak themselves.
Also, I've noticed that, yeah, actually, a lot of this is acrylic. I do a mixture, mixed media. So if you look over here, I'll make this go down. This is the silver sun and moon is acrylic, and the gold is gold leafing. That's 24 karat gold leaf. And then the oops. The part up here is all acrylic, so I use gold acrylic to do that part. I'm just fixing my stand right now. I got this pretty cool stand for my iPhone. The reason why I stopped doing the longer videos is it's a lot of work, and I don't have any space on my computer. So if I'm going to be doing videos, it's probably going to be on my phone because it's so little effort, and the amount of space that I use is a lot less. I'll show you the acrylic paints that I use for the gold. This is for the silver. This is Art Deco acrylic and metallic silver. And this is the gold I use. It's Art Deco. And this is acrylic. So I really like acrylic. I really love oil. I really love gold leafing. I just really love crafts. I like to do things on my own. And I like to fill my home with beautiful art. All my art obviously can be purchased, but for the most part, I do this for myself. I do this to capture what I've seen in DMT space. So I was telling people before, this right over here was the portal into spirit that I saw, and it's obviously covered in celestial writing. I couldn't quite figure out what it was saying because, you know, in DMT space, everything happens so fast. So to me, this is a singularity point in the center, and then you were traveling up it, and it was covered with this celestial language, and I didn't really make out what exactly it says. So whatever characters that I remembered, I just put up there. So obviously, if you do know the celestial language, it is not going to make sense, but I tried to, you know, this took years and years and years of research because I did not know anything about the celestial language. I did not know anything about different occult languages. So it took about 4 years to figure out what the heck I saw. And I was, you know, just painting and trying to express it. And I think the more you learn, the more you research, the more things just come together, and you're able to paint literally a better picture of what you saw. So, yeah.
That involves some sort of supernatural being, supernatural So in very different ways that the way we use it.
But yeah, I don't know if it was my last DMT trip or my second DMT trip, but I did see the dome of jewels, so that's what I'm doing at the top. I'm kind of like combining DMT experiences to make one large piece. So my last experience had the singularity point of, singularity with the portal into spirit, with the celestial language, and then I'm lining that with multicolored, multifaceted jewels. And then the third layer is going to be the geometry, which obviously is the most difficult part. So I'm kind of leaving that to the last part because a lot of it's very smudgy and I'm just gonna have to do it by hand, certain parts like that. But it's not gonna be, I mean, it's gonna be hard. That's why I'm saving it for last. And then obviously is the Flower of Life, which was another DMT trip that I had started off with the Flower of Life. And then bam, it went into the white space. And then I guess I'm combining because then we have mushrooms over here. I've never really had a full-on visionary experience with mushrooms. It was mostly like feeling and panic attacks. So I just like the way the mushrooms look. For the face, I actually kind of want to change that, and I'm thinking, comment if you think this is a good idea or not, but I wanted to actually make the face geometry instead of making it a girl face. So I don't know. And the reason why I left the rest blank is because at the top, all the creative juices are flowing. And I'm kind of getting in the rhythm, but by the middle, I like to freestyle and like freehand a lot of stuff. So what I was thinking was in the windows to do different scenes like constellations, stars, and different stuff like that. Maybe different entities looking in through the windows or something. I don't really know, but I know by the time I get into the middle part, I almost wish that there was negative space so I could start freehanding. So that's why I left the bottom all negative space. So kind of excited to get there, but for now I'm focusing on this part. Oh, you like the girls? Yeah. Well, I did another one where the girl had a face too. And it was very similar. So I know I kind of like it as well, but I thought it would be a little bit more interesting having the girl's face geometry. But this is actually this like cathedral style. Is based off of a Islamic mosque, I think in Iran. The Blue Mosque, I don't know what it's called, but I think you guys know what I'm talking about. It's basically the same mosque that I drew. And I just, instead of, having the names of God and everything, I decided to just do a psychedelic landscape. And yeah, so that's what I'm doing. It actually took quite a long time to even get to this stage. And it took me about a year to start doing, coloring it in and stuff. And I think the reason is because I like to think about my painting before I execute it. So a lot of these paintings, a lot of people ask, well, why are these so expensive? Well, they take years. They literally take, thank you. They literally take years to do. This one alone took 2 years just to get to this level. The other one took about 1.5 years. And I take a lot of breaks because I like to really think about it before, because I guess oil is a very forgiving medium where you could just like paint over it, but you know, that's just a lot of work. But yeah, I like to share my techniques with people that, you know, might one day want to get involved and do something like this. But I feel a lot of painting is taking a lot of breaks. And I do a lot of I don't know if you guys follow me on Instagram, but I do a lot of graphic art, and that's what I do in between. So if I'm not like physically painting something, then or drawing something like physically, I actually do it on my iPad. And believe it or not, drawing on your iPad and drawing like physically is basically the same thing. And it actually like improves your drawing skills. So whether you do it on an iPad or you do it like actual sketching, you're always improving. And I also found that actually drawing geometry also helped improve my drawing dramatically. So if you guys, you know, are too afraid or don't know where to start with figures and like, you know, drawing whatever, then start drawing geometry and see how quickly you improve as an artist. It's a really great tool to improve your artistic abilities. I definitely find that to be true.
Good. Excellent. Excellent. So what's the suggestion there? Good. Yes, so this is starting to look like a pendant, something that we've worn around the body. So now we've got not only portable artifacts, but adornments, actual things that you're wearing. And the exquisite nature of the female form here is clearly emphasizing the feminine power, and then all of those conceptual links perhaps to nature, fertility, and so on. We might never know. But this is one of the key arguments for a kind of a goddess worshipping way of living, way of thinking, way of thinking.
Also, when you are painting, specifically oil painting, I would tell everyone to just open up all the windows. Preferably wear gloves, but because a lot of these paints are toxic, I just try to keep everything as clean as possible so nothing gets on my hands, because I find that when I do use gloves, it's just so difficult. It's just really hard for me. So I just, again, try to keep the handles really clean so I could just not have to use gloves. And sometimes I'll use a mask as well. So if I'm using like say a varnish or something, if I only use a varnish at the end, obviously, but if I'm using a varnish to create a barrier, I'll usually put on a mask to do that.
Sticking the theme of rock art and zooming us forward to a little more recent sort of like ancient Mars epic. Incredible rock art in southern Africa. The Drakensberg Mountains in particular are very famous for rock art in particular. Panel comes from around about 3,000 years ago, where the density refined as art making techniques improved. What do we think we're looking at here? And that's a deliberately challenging question, because it takes a long time to kind of compose a lot of that.
Also, what helps is don't load too much paint on your palette. If you put too much paint on your palette and you don't use it all, it's going to get hard. So if you do load too much paint on your palette, what you could do is just put some saran wrap on it, and it will actually save it for the next time that you want to paint.
And these were done by my ancestral sand people, that are still living in this community that I've got some today. But what's going on here, I mean, it's interpreted as the Elam is dying, and this...
Once I paint all of the black in, then I'm gonna go back and fix all the muddy parts, like right over here, and put more green and yellow in it. So usually I would paint the whole entire background and then do, you know, if you're gonna be freehanding, but a lot of this is so intricate that I just rather do the line drawing, and then, well, what I do is I'll do the line drawing and then I'll transfer it using architectural, what is it called? It's like draft architectural, like graphite paper. And if you do something, let's say on Illustrator or Procreate or something, and you want to blow it up, what you would do is I go to, you know, FedEx, Kinko's, or any printing company, or like, yeah, transfer paper, exactly, graphite paper. So I will blow it up at like Kinko's or something. I don't even know if Kinko's is still open, but I'll go to a printer, I'll blow it up, and I'll blow it up, and they have this like, it's called architectural, like mapping or something. I don't know what it's called. Oh, no, drafts, like an architectural drafts, or like, it's for like, when they're like creating like I guess blueprints. That's what it's called, blueprints. So you use the blueprint setting and you blow it up by, I blew this one up by 36 by 48, and then I'll use the transfer paper, like somebody had said, the graphite paper, and then I will tape it on all sides, and then I'll transfer it. And that's, to me, the easiest way to transfer such an intricate piece onto canvas.
So when we're in the throes of the trance state, they're actually in very danger, a lot of danger, and not useful because of the fire. These, well, not going to put that during the morning, but they, not at the time. This is one of the mysteries of this. So, very similar concept. When people are in a trance state, you can see this around the world. Things can happen to them in the morning, think, oh, wow, that's like, yeah, but just like someone's just like smashed the glass and go, oh, what's that happening across the world? And they seem
And again, I use as little oil or medium, fluid medium as possible, because I find that it can get really streaky. My first painting that I had done, my first large scale piece that I completed, that honestly I don't feel like I completed, because I still look at it and see new things that I can add onto it. So I used a little bit too much of the walnut oil, and it actually, like in some spots, is really streaky. So as little oil as possible will get as much pigment on top as possible, and it will look a lot better, and it won't look streaky at all. So also there are different types of walnut varnishes. So there's the dry matte finish, and then there's the high gloss finish. This is the high gloss finish. The reason why I like the high gloss finish is because it dries faster. So you can, you know, work wet on wet, but if you're working wet on wet, it has to be really quickly, and I would say within the day. And that I like it because it could dry within a day, and then you could put another layer, and you can work really quickly.
Similar kinds of practices. Many of us will be familiar, perhaps, with some of these cultures in Central and South America, who are known perhaps for taking substances, sometimes ceremonies, and obviously songs of sending and breathing. Threads and similarities, obviously very important differences and uniqueness among these cultures, which is really important. But the term shaman actually originates from the world of anthropology in terms of when we first recognised it, and is attributed to the people up in the so-called Arctic Siberian complex, of cultures up in the northern hemisphere. And these groups of people, there are many different identities, different communities and tribes, if you like. Is an example of a Mongolian shaman. This is where anthropologists first encountered this phenomenon and first described it in any detail. And that term has now been taken.
And when you're painting, make sure you use the handle as much as possible and extend it. So the palm of your hand, I'm wearing my Grumpy Cat Christmas PJs, but the palm of your hand doesn't go smack on it and then you have a whole bunch of paint on you. So I make use of the handle.
Shamans will actually describe it as their soul goes on the journey into the spirit world, and there they can talk to people, they can have encounters with spiritual entities and beings. And sometimes if a person in the community is unwell, or sick, or some calamity is befalling them, it's sometimes interpreted as if their soul has gone wandering. Their soul has wandered out, and the shaman's job is to go back into the spirit world and retrieve that soul and restore that person to wellness. Within the community, they play a really important role around mediation of disputes. Sometimes a soul journey can go and they can receive wisdom from the other world about who's responsible for what and what to do to fix it. And of course, it needs healing. So they have a really important role to play in the actual healing of the community. And so yes, these are spiritual specialists, but they play an essential function, an essential role in these societies.
And also I like to put the excess on like a different part. So I can just pick up the paint and glide it and then pick up some more paint. And so I do it that way. It's a lot easier than holding the palette. I don't like holding the palette because sometimes I will drop the palette and all the paint will go on the floor. So I keep the palette right next to me on a table.
You see all kinds of things. So it's a shell, cigarette butts, dominoes, all kinds of things. They have significance in this context, and they can be thrown, and the specialist, the sandwoman, can read them, and they can make divinations in that regard. Now, early colonial visitors that first encountered these communities obviously never seen anything like this before, and struggled to find the words to describe what they were looking at, who these people were, what they did. And that is where the term witch doctor came from. Okay, so in popular culture, we recognise these kinds of people, perhaps Judaism, as being witch doctors. And even since then, that term has been corrupted, and we now think of it as being something sinister, something dangerous. And actually, the term originally came from the fact that these people, part of their job was to protect you against witchcraft. Okay, so they're literally doctors against witchcraft, which is a very different way of understanding what they do. Yes, good point, yeah. So that leads us into our next section about witchcraft. Now, witchcraft is one of those really sort of emotional terms, it's a lot of historical baggage, means to things, to people. And within our own culture, we assign different meanings to it as well, and have done over time. Now, has anyone heard of Evans Pritchard? Yes. Yes? Good. He was a Roman Catholic. Was he? Yes. Very important to know, and it's important to ask how much is Roman Catholicism influenced the conclusion he drew. Very interesting. And furthermore, how much it influenced the students of anthropology at Oxford. Yeah, good. But that's a really useful reminder for me, actually, that when we're doing anthropological fieldwork, when we're exploring these cultures, we're always taking ourselves ourselves into that space. We're always taking our own belief systems, our own worldview, our own cultural assumptions, values and expectations, and that will inevitably almost colour the interpretations that we make and the conclusions that we draw. So as an anthropologist, it's just, you can't get rid of that. You can't ever be truly objective. It's impossible because you're a human being. But the way around it for an anthropologist is to be conscious of it, to be aware of it, and to take account of that, and to be open about that. You know, writing up your findings, be open about it. I disturbed by this, and I realise that may have influence.
A lot of the stuff comes from my brain, and I don't really have a reference point for a lot of the stuff that I paint. So what I'll do is, like for the jewels, I will look up jewels so I can see where to put the shadow, where to put the highlight, and all that stuff. Same thing for like the face and stuff like that, or like the hair. I'll look up. Actually, doing stuff on Procreate really has helped me learn how to do hair really well. So the same technique that I use on digital art, I use on oil painting as well. And it's pretty much the same process. It's just like layering color, and usually the darker color is on the bottom, the lighter color is on top. But for hair, actually, it's the exact opposite. It's the darker color, well, the lighter color underneath and the darker color on top. So say you'd want to do black hair. What you would do is I would put in like a dark gray to a gray color, and use like gray or white for highlights. And then I would do the lines black. And again, I would use, what I use for all of my paints is the 040 brush, which is literally the smallest brush on the market. A little bit expensive, but if you want to get that really fine detail, this is literally the best brush for that. And this is what I paint this whole entire canvas with. So it's kind of painstaking, but the cool thing about oil painting is that it kind of puts you in this meditative state. So you can go for hours and paint and not even notice, which is kind of cool.
That is when you would call in something like this, if you got them as an person, a specialist, in this case called the Windsor, brought in to counteract the witchcraft, the number of ways in which that would be done, and the cause of the witchcraft, the person would be healed, and whatever misfortune.
Also, the great thing about these brushes is they're really good quality, and the brush like doesn't like fray and like go, you know, all over the place. That way, like if you want to do a fine line, you don't have to worry about like a fraying brush creating like a spray effect. I've had that, and I get these from Blick. I don't know what company they're by. Oh no, these are Blick Academic Synthetic. That's what they are. Yeah, the 40 brush. And I buy them in bulk because they're usually sold out, and as soon as they're released, I just buy like 10 of them, and they last forever. You clean them really well, these will last years, and you can just keep on using them and using them and using them over and over and over. But the trick is to keep your brushes clean, or to clean them as soon as you use them.
While we're in African space, though, I want to kind of touch briefly upon another example of ritualized practice. Many of us will have been familiar or heard of this religion, Buddhism, or more commonly known as Voodoo, perhaps, which today, in our kind of modern culture, has been all taken
See
out
that
of
one right there? I have to make
since,
this a little bit bigger. I'm just gonna, fix
but actually it
everything once I put the
originated
black
in
all
the
down.
legitimate religion today. And it originated in the Holy Kingdom, West Africa, which was in its kind of heyday between 1600 and 1900. Now, we see some similarities again with some of the ritual practices of Vodun in West Africa.
And sometimes it's good to have like two brushes going, like I do right now. See, I got a little black smush right there. All I gotta do is lift it up.
Personalities, some of them are grumpy, some of them are mischievous, some of them are nice, some of them are helpful. And
And that's how, that's a good thing about oil, because it's such a heavy paint that you could just pick it up, and especially if it's wet on wet. And
compared to the shamanic practices we've been looking at, is that in one of these ceremonies, when it's expected that somebody is going to go into a trance state and commune with the spirits, it can really be anybody sitting around that might get seized by a spirit. Okay, you don't actually have to be with a specialist. There are specialists that are better at doing it than others. But instead of venturing into the spirit world to commune with spirits, the spirits come and get you, and they actually take over the body as a form of possession. And that can happen to anybody sitting around. So sometimes there have been reports of people watching ceremony going on, not really that interested, and suddenly a spirit goes into them and animated. And again, very dangerous things happen when you're in that sort of state. Which surprisingly is.
yep, that is true. That's why I talk about possession, because that can definitely happen. That's happened to me.
But it's very interesting, and there's been a lot of academic study of this process. Now, historically, of course,
And I wasn't even taking the medicine at the time.
the rulers in the Roman Kingdom must send their people to slavery. So we ended up with a lot of practitioners who were well done in Haiti, for example, which is on the way to the Americas, and then also in America. Now, once these people came under the jurisdiction of the colonizers, they weren't allowed to practice voodoo anymore, even though it's so important to them.
Whew, almost done with, the base part. I'm not even done with it because I haven't even done like the highlights or anything. I like to highlight the dark. When you're painting, you're putting the darkest color on the bottom and then the lightest color on top. So right now I'm just laying the dark colors down, and then I'm gonna go in and highlight the green with yellow and white. And stuff like that. Although, if anybody has any suggestions on what color to do the face of the circuit board entity, let me know, because I am still kind of figuring it out, and I really don't know what color I want to make it, but I figured it can't be black because the head's black, so it's just gonna maybe, but maybe a gray, I don't know.
Clever about how they managed to maintain that. This is an example of a really altar. You can see the blending there of as the Pentacles, as I said earlier on, talking about control of the nation, let's put voodoo dolls, black magic, in actual fact, the voodoo religion, elements of it that we consider challenging perhaps for us. Some of the ceremonies and things that were quizzingly sometimes sacrifices that were made using chickens. Yes, yeah, so. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a dark side, and that's just very much thought about that much, but obviously
And for the black, I didn't use any oil at all to thin the paint. I just left it as is.
back to a question earlier on about witchcraft being something you can do to somebody. That in a personal sense would more commonly be known as sorcery. Okay? So the witchcraft is in essence sorcery is the deliberate manipulation of spiritual forces to do harm or to serve yourself at the expense of others. Sorcery. Now, in our own country, in our own culture, we're certainly not now our own Catholic, visualized magical specialists. And has anybody heard of the concept of cunning folk? Anyone heard of these people? Cunning men, cunning women, and both genders again. So these are people, women, and their husbands, such as in Europe, who were very much part of the local village community, but they had some special skills and some special knowledge of basically folk magic. So magic that was kind of available to everybody in the community. They had some knowledge of this and this and that, but they were just really good at it. And they had expert knowledge, and they studied it. And often they came from a long line of people that had done something.
All right. All right, now I just like to go in between and make sure there's no like big splotchy parts or like buildup of excess paint anywhere, because I like the paint to be as flat as possible. Because again, this is like, you know, it's not abstract or anything where you want to build a lot of paint. I personally don't like that. I like a very thin layer of paint. So I just go in and just all the excess paint, I kind of pick it up on my brush and then take a napkin like this and just get all the excess paint off. So I like it to be a smooth surface when I'm creating a picture, because again, I used a lot of paint on the other painting, and honestly, when it dries, it just, I don't know. I don't really like the look, especially with, you know, psychedelic art. There's so much going on, you know what I mean? Texture is a good thing, but you see how much paint I'm lifting off right now?
But there's an essence of power in the books themselves, just having them as power. Now, witchcraft, of course, culturally went through a bit of a bad time, the 80s and the early modern period.
All right, for the most part, I think that's good. Another thing, painting makes you like super hungry. I find myself like stopping, again, that's a really great tip that I'll tell everybody. Just stop painting, you know, when you've been painting for like an hour or two, and just take like, I'd say stand like 10 feet away and just look at it from different angles and see how it looks. Because when you're painting and you're so close, it's not going to look the same way as when you step back and you look at it. And a lot of the times paintings are meant to be up on walls you know, and it's going to be at least, you know, 8 feet away or 6 feet away. And you're not, you know, always looking so close to it. So the way a painting looks, say, like that, and then the way a painting looks farther back, this is again not that far, but you see it looks very different, and it's really good to just take a step back and to see how it's going to look, you know, on a wall, or also doing it from different angles, because a lot of the times, you know, paintings aren't going to be at eye level. So it's a really good way of just looking at things and seeing what needs to be fixed.
which is already starting to get a bad reputation. They must be the ones. And they need to
Also, when you're picking up your other paintbrush, make sure like you clean the handle because this always, like, I just throw it down and it gets on the paint, and then paint gets on my hand. So that's my cat biting me. That's where I got all that stuff from. But when you clean the handle of your brush, you don't get any paint on your hand. So that's always a plus. For me, clean painting is literally the only way I'm going to be painting, because I hate messes. And for a long time, I stopped painting because it was so messy. So I had to just, you know, clean everything up for me to like actually want to do it, because who wants to clean up a paint mess? Nobody. That's why it's better to do it as you go along.
sanction assault on feminine spirituality, which has had an incredible legacy in all places.
All right, now I'm gonna
And
go in with the yellow. And the thing is, since there's already green on top, every single time you put the yellow, you're gonna have to clean your brush. And then once it's, you know, I mean, it's not gonna be completely clean, but once it's relatively clean, you're gonna go take more yellow, load it on your brush, and then you can continue. What I like to do is I like to put the blob right there, and then whatever is left, I like to do like that. And do like the smaller, the blobs, like I'll load up a lot on my brush, and then I'll do like the circle, and then whatever is left, I'll go in. I have to change, because I have to go closer. And then that's for like the finer detail line. That got smushed, but again, it's not a big deal. Clean off your brush. And what I'll do is I'll put, it's great to have one of these lights too. This is a ring light, and I use this because this is the only way I can see the fine details and the lines to paint. It's just a lot easier for me.
So I hope in that very brief overview, I've given you a glimpse into what for me are some of the touch points and insights that I into why.
And then you see, this time around, since I'm doing the line, I have a much smaller dab of paint. There's still some green in there. Get that off, and then go like that. There we go. So you're just building color. And that's how you do it, from dark to light, from dark to light. And let's say that's a little too yellow. So you go in with the green, and then you just put some more green in there. And let's say it's a little bit too much paint in there. Remember, it's supposed to be straight. You just go in with the black and you clean it up.
and human sacrifice, just to be one of those sinister and no principles. And before I open up to some questions, don't forget to check out the new exhibition that's just opened yesterday, I think, in the Australian Museum, which touches upon, I believe, I haven't said yet, some of these themes and ideas. So let's start, so let's say 22nd of January. Oh, good question. 7 to 9 usually in the evening.
Oh man, my battery is going to die soon, so let's see. Gotta figure this out.
Yes. Good. Yeah, well, in the classes that I run, conversation is a big part of it. And will you provide source material for the photographs? When you have shade on the screen, who can give us the teachers know, sometimes it's not know. Well, if they don't know, it's questionable. Yeah, absolutely. So these things are all open to interpretation and interrogation. And to me, that's what makes a really invigorating class, is to have that person's conversation. Anyone got any questions? So, would you touch on next? Talking about it, and I gather that there is still such yes, yes, absolutely. Well, I would love to. It's not on the agenda right now, but that doesn't mean that we can't get into that in relation to other themes. I think it's actually exciting. I'll bear that in mind. Any other questions before we head to this? So it's technical note, it's not negative on the page.
Let's see if I could.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. You know, when, I mean, kind of use the example of some of those early architects like you and some of the observers out there.
Ah, great. Charger's working.
There are incredible variations in the nature of their account. Some of them completely historical because of their structure.
Okay. I'm gonna do it this way. Alright, let's see. How do I unlock this? Alright, well I'm just gonna have to do it this way. Okay.
Okay, folks, thank you very much.
I'm gonna have to get an extension cord for this. 1 second.
Wawa hoagies are made fresh just for you. Gotta have a Wawa.
Alright, Adina, we got it. That's my dog barking up a storm. Sorry about that. because the mailman's here, and of course my dog loses her mind every single time she hears the mailman. All right, Adina, we get it. You can protect us. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for anybody that the rotation is all off, so I'm gonna have to just move everything. Thank you, Adina, for protecting us. All right, I think that's good. I gotta move this a little bit. It's very delicate because my easel's broken. And my easel's broken because it was like a $20 easel. And I mean, how could you beat a $20 easel? And I haven't replaced it because I really don't want to spend money. But yeah, hold on one second. I'm just gonna refill my cup, put on a different lecture, and continue painting. I wish I was like, what is it, ambidextrous, because my hand hurts. Like, because you have to like hold your hand in a certain way, or else like you're gonna get paint, like a smack of paint right over there. So you always, I mean, you could use a dowel, obviously. That would be the smarter way to paint, but I make everything difficult. Oh my goodness, and I just wanted to show you guys, this is so freaking cool. I just ordered some witch bells off of Etsy, and look at how it came. Oh my goodness, it's like tie-dye. Did they do that themselves? I don't know, but that's like the package it came in. This is why I love Etsy, because people are so like creative with the packaging, and you know how they put like so much effort into it. It's just so beautiful. And this is what I had gotten. These are little witch's bells. I got 2 of them, one for the front and the back of the doors, so kind of excited. It's this woman who like makes all of this by hand on Etsy, and yeah, I got a whole bunch of them for the house. Has anybody tripped recently? I know I haven't. It's so funny. I, do psychedelic art, and I do psychedelic clothing, but I haven't tripped in quite a while because I've had to take a step back. Life became very psychedelic. I started tripping in my dreams, and it became really intense. And I just like, I felt like I needed to center myself and take a step back and reflect and create art and experience life. That's another reason why, you know, I took a little bit of a step back, because it was becoming all like a little too intense for me. And I needed to give myself time to, again, reflect and heal and process a lot of the information that I was receiving in such a short amount of time. As you guys know, because like, you know, you've probably went through it as well, after, you know, simulation shattering experiences and life altering experiences, you kind of have to just take a step back and exercise a lot of self-care and self-love, and a lot of that is just spending a lot of time alone. So that's what I've been doing. I've been spending a lot of time alone. And I like it, you know, I really like it. I remember pre-psychedelics, I was super needy, you know, and I needed to be around people, and I hated my own company, and I hated being alone. But the more I dove into my conscious or unconscious, whatever you want to call it, the more I cherished my alone time. And a lot of my time here on Earth, the past 5 years, has been in solitude, alone, in quiet. I don't know. It's completely different from how I used to be. I feel like I'm always, you know, updating myself. So like before, I was really afraid to be alone. And that's why like I jumped into relationship after relationship after relationship. And after I had done DMT was the first time that I was just alone, you know, for years. And I learned to be comfortable in my solitude, and learned to not need any external validation. And I think that really helped me on my journey, because before I was always just, I remember, alone. I remember feeling this deep loneliness, and I always felt alone, and I almost felt like I gave off this very desperate vibe, you know. And the more I was able to be comfortable being alone, the more empowered I felt. And I feel that's why I started doing these videos, because like I was having all of these crazy ass experiences, and I didn't have anybody to share them with, and I didn't know anybody that would listen without looking at me like I had 12 heads and calling me crazy. So it's kind of cool that I was able to be able to express how I felt, and have so many, you know, people understand what I was going through. And then it became all too much, because I think as a artist, or whatever you want to call it, as a human, as a creator, you kind of lose focus, and it becomes about the ego, and I never wanted it to become that. So I don't know. I just feel like that we're living in an age where like it's like all of this instant gratification and attention, and you kind of start living for the algorithms, and you forget, you know, that you forget why you originally started. So for me, it's whenever I'm liking the attention too much, I step back to again reevaluate, you know, what I'm here for and why I'm doing this. So, you know, I'm very thankful to everyone that's been able to stick around, even though I've been ghost. But I've been really like, you know, like fixing myself emotionally and spiritually, and a lot of that is that takes place in silence. That takes place behind closed doors and alone. Yeah. But anyway, let's get back to painting.
At a mission at Mona Mona in North Queensland, Australia, a young man named Rob, who had been serving as the mission's as the mission's chief assistant, was in full bloom of health, but fell suddenly and mysteriously ill. Yeah. The doctor, S.M. Lambert of the Western Pacific Health Service, was called for.
Right.
The white missionary, baffled by his helper's unexplainable distress, begged the doctor to examine him. Dr. Lambert made a thorough check. He found no fever. Rob complained of no particular pains, and in fact, there were no evident signs of disease whatsoever, except for the fact that Rob appeared very weak and seriously ill. The mission was located in a culturally divided part of North Queensland, with converts to the Christian mission making up a sizable community, living alongside a similarly significant group of non-convert Aboriginals. Among these Aboriginals holding to their native traditions was a very famous shaman or medicine man. Another way we could speak of a shaman. Man of medicine. Not really a doctor, though. Different kind of medicine. Anywho. His name was Nebo. Nebo.
Can we just call him that?
Sure.
Like,
We'll call him
way better than what it's
It's
like.
like Nito with a
Nebo. Sorry.
Rob told the missionary that he had been boned.
I hate when that happens.
That is to say, Nebo had pointed a bone at him, and Rob was convinced that this would bring about his very imminent demise. The record does not indicate the variety of bone that we're referring to. It's anyway. So the doctor and the missionary, taking Rob's claims seriously, went to Nebo and threatened him. If he did not go with them to see Rob, they would cut off the food the mission was providing to the tribe and drive his people away from their land. Nebo agreed to go with them. Leaning over Rob's 6-foot sick bed, the shaman told the young convert that the boning had all been a mistake. It was only a joke. In truth, he had never pointed any bone at him in the first place.
That's what they all say.
Yeah.
He said it was a joke?
Just kidding. I was just kidding when I cursed you to die. That's it first. Rob's recovery was almost instantaneous. That very evening, he was back at work, happy and strong as ever. Australian Aboriginal boning is a form of the evil eye. You can't get over that, can you?
No.
A way of cursing someone in a way that causes the victim's quick and inevitable demise. That is, unless supernatural means are invoked to stem the flow of life out of the unfortunate victim's body. The evil eye is the mother of all curses, and it's the first subject in our 4th series here on Occult Confessions. We are going to devote the next 8 episodes to discussing the black magic through the ages. From curses to human sacrifice to dark.
And I'm so pleased to introduce Kim Schwenk. Kim is rare book cataloger at UC San Diego Special Collections and Archives Library, and an antiquarian bookseller with Lux Mantis Booksellers. She has a specialization in Americana and European witchcraft history of early printed occult texts, and bibliographic studies of magical curses using plants and objects. She's also active in occult sciences and the occult book community, both as a researcher and a practitioner. And as of 2019, she is researching occult ex libris, otherwise known as hex libris, or occult book plates. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Kim. Thanks so much, Kim.
Thank you, Erin. I hope everyone can hear me, and I want to give a big shout out to Erin and the BSA for this invitation to talk about occult identities in books and beyond. I hope you find something that resonates. I'm going to jam here because I have a lot to show you. My interest in the occult has been really a slow burn. It's something I've been fueling for a while. Professionally, I have this really unique position to work partially in the book trade and partially in the rare book library as a cataloger, which is a complex marriage and almost an alchemical wedding for me. As I navigate the nuances of bibliographic description, it's really tricky to work in both, actually. As a bookseller, I can afford a lot of liberties in the book trade, and I tend to focus on controversial material and talk about why it's important in the context of the now and the context of collection development. And to be truthful, and really in my stage of life of cataloging, I'm a baby cataloger, I'm an adolescent, but not really to occult studies. I do feel though, at this time, the time of neutrality is over, and the impetus to challenge problematic bibliographic description and collection development is active and activated. So this poses an interesting discussion about occult knowledge ownership, provenance, but more critically, how individuals have dictated the evolution of occult history. I became interested in this because of this idea of book ownership and coveting knowledge and the ideology behind collecting occult texts in an almost ironic possession, and what we do to protect that knowledge and to the objects. So I got that started. This was one of the first books I sold at a book fair, or in my book trade career here. And it tells an interesting story, as it's my first foray into occult text provenance as a narrative. This book was owned by and library of James Wickersham, who was the district judge for Alaska, delegate to the Congress in 1917. He was a diehard politician, but also a mountaineer, and he made the first record attempt to climb Mount Denali, although failing due to the impassable mountain face, later known as the Wickersham Wall. He also authored a book called Whence Came the American Indians, a study in comparative ethnology, compiling anthropological observations of local tribal customs, referencing early indigenous peoples' observations of astrology, divination, and even witchcraft. It allowed this book, because of the ownership, allowed some discovery beyond just the content of the book, as ownership and production became a focal point of how a book as an object presents a compelling occult identity in itself. The other thing that got me kind of hyped about this was I gave a talk a couple of years ago at a book conference, esoteric book conference on esoteric book plates. And it got me thinking about identity for esoteric printers and esoteric publishers. We talk a lot about unique identifiers and relationship designators in the information science and the metadata world. But really what it does is to add specificity and recognition to creators and the like. There is very much a comprehensive, unique identity in occult literature and how it fits into the world of esoteric and magical studies. Many occult publishers, like you see here, have branded themselves with magical logos and in product. Even their choices of paper bindings and materials used, whether it's animal skin, choices of parchment, fonts, ink, selections of artwork, and etc. They're very careful and considerate about aesthetics. The metaphysical structure of an occult book is that it embodies the skeleton and the molding of this body of work. There's also a purpose to elicit a practice in magical text, to absorb the text, so that the person reading the material just doesn't consume the media that they're reading, that they become the media that they're reading. So, in lieu of this, what actually is the occult? And in sort of brief, broad definition, the occult arena, whether it is from a practitioner, research, or documentary view, the field of study itself is rife with issues. Those stem from not just the quote-unquote academy, but the implementation of the occult practice. So let's start with a very traditional dictionary definition of or relating to magic, astrology, or any system claiming use of knowledge or secret knowledge or supernatural powers or agencies, or it is something beyond the range of ordinary knowledge or understanding. It's mysterious. I tend to like Ayana Said's description here, definition in Arabic influences on early modern philosophy, and we'll get to know that a lot later. And she says, for the sake of brevity and respecting tangents, put simply, if we deconstruct the occult to rephrase a deep colonial definition of the occult, foundationally, the occult is completely based in astrology to harness the natural philosophical need to explain how celestial bodies causally influence terrestrial ones. This is an Arabic-based definition into a modern occult one, albeit Western one, of as above, so below. Celestial bodies serve as signs, sympathies, and correspondence on how the Hermetics decipher those based on their experiences. So it is not just about the content that makes a text of or about the occult. It is that the physical occult is entrenched within those principles. For example, a grimoire, spellbook, is not just a book with magic in it, but it encompasses the metaphysics, the paper, the structure, the imagery, because of its cultural identity, because of the commerce that propels it, and of the ancestors of the creators and the art that it inspires. So let's continue on with the metaphysical for a moment. There's a certain level of reveal here, and generational teaching, and frankly, cultural appropriation, Eastern to Western from that. With that in mind, I really want to illustrate through key text and imagery to initiate and emulate our efforts as humans to recreate this experience, a reclamation of energy, perhaps, certainly in a literary way, to invoke an act of possession and a ritual of consuming identity and acquisition. In a sense, when we acquire something, we bind ourselves to these books as objects. We do this metaphysically and physically with marks of physical attachments, which produce memory and ownership. There is a certain fetishization that happens with objects, and I'm talking about this in a little bit in terms of cultural appropriation. However, cross-culturally, there is a symbiotic connection between practitioner and the author, creator, and the tangible object. It is integral to the
I like to go back and forth and bounce around different parts of the painting, so yeah, it's really random.
Similibus has to do with the process and the metaphor in creation. In this case, this image of making a cursed tablet. By many accounts, making a mark on something is a redirection of energy and also a possible indication of power, materiality reflecting the content and performance of that object. So if language is essentially a modality of power, a mark is an extension of that magical practice. And in that practice, when we think about binding words as objects, in this case, we recover our own sense of poetic language and expression, ritual, as fundamental constituents of the human experience. idea behind the occult becoming ritual expression is the transmission of text and imagery, but also the transmission of an identity of the creator itself. The occult has imagined, patronizing, or critically marginalized key creators of publication history. The best way for me to do that is to contextualize graphic recommendations and the book as objects, bibliographically, rather than linearly talk about occult text. So one of the ways this idea begins with the attachment of incantations to objects in terms of textual and visual marks is some of the earliest forms that incantations, specifically curses, with text appear in ancient Mediterranean cultures with depictions. These textual objects are verbs that transfer an attachment. In this case, on this particular tablet was an issue of cursing or stolen property. In Greek, the defixio is closely defined as something to be fixed as a verb, affixed likewise, or attached. These tablets were made of lead, very crude metal, and inscribed with the stylus with text of secret names of those demons and divinations, which were only understood by the magician, the creator who made it, and the communication to the spirits themselves. Formulaic in nature, the tablets feature direct binding utterance, an appeal for supernatural assistance, and the anthology for the intended target of the curse, coupled with symbols and figures of the gods. Then they were deposited near the intended target, where they resided, died, or sometimes even worn as an amulet. The fact that these curses were written down in some cases accompanied by oral instruction and transferred to a place of engagement, whether it was a tomb or a water source, shows movement towards humanity's understanding of the universal power of language and posterity. It is in this idea that there is a lasting power of language being attached to the physical, and that gives form to expressive and metaphorical aspects of the human experience, even if in offensive intent. So introduces the idea of the anathema, right? The concept of placing an inanimate object under the protection of a deity, and in this case, under God. While not the original use of curses on objects, it's definitely the first instance of protection for texts, either in handwritten in manuscript form or in the bound codex as texts have evolved. As sacred as the writing itself, books within the church were considered holy vessels. So what better way to place protection by putting them in the book itself? This is representative of some of the most ultimate forms of ownership and power dynamics. And here's just a list of a few varying degrees of book curses translated that I have come across, and you can see from the 12th to the 14th century how severe they might be if you were to take stolen property away from a library. To really drive this idea home of sort of object and amulet, I really want to quote Hugo from the British Library. I was very impressed by his talk on Ethiopian amulet objects and recipe books. He says, occult texts or magical texts are living objects, and it's so true. Materiality is something you might wear. Its transgressive existence as something in the present. And once you place the marks, these sacred objects become holistic. Not only does it just contain magic, but it is magic or sacred to a community of people, that reasons that will exist and survive for generations for people. This idea that possession is permanent, is a transfer of power. This is what I'm trying to get at. These types of manuscripts help codify cultural identities, but solidify the power and the concept that the structure of the book and how it performs, the paper, what are the elemental components of that paper, whether it's plant or animal, the inks that are being used as ritual products, and predominantly in the Western world, the bookplate, as example here, is intrinsically attached to the creator and to the owner. And to note those tracings is of utmost importance. And, who might better know to curse their own books than the granddaddy of the occult, Mr. John Dee. John Dee, as a Renaissance practitioner, magician, when he was not talking to angels or trying to bail himself out of imprisonment by selling his books, no less, and trying to impress Queen Elizabeth I, accumulated a massive library. He had a cataloger, and established one of the most provocative accumulations of occult ownership during the Renaissance. His library itself acts as a social agent, playing a mediatorial role in the politics and reading and writing and the study of magic. Occult ownership and annotation lends itself to the mindset of the occultist and sets a very high precedent. And I'm going to mention Dee very briefly in the terms of the amalgamation of his library and the marginalia of his books, because his research on his well-preserved library manuscripts from his annotations say something not just about the study of his library catalog, for example. And in it, there are marks like the one with that purple arrow there, this ladder inscription that he used a lot. He also used the symbol of Jupiter, shorthand for his name. These are little clues that are attributed to him. And we can thank Andreas Fromenschein, who was his cataloger, and he also worked as a bookseller for the famed Berkman family of printers in the 16th century. So Dee himself created his own identity through these use of symbols. And in this one, his Monas Hieroglyphica is basically Dee's cosmogram itself. It appears on this frontispiece. And it is Dee's intent to offer it, the cosmogram, as a mystical object for relative contemplation. But it was also seemingly important and a unique identifier attributed to him. This symbol, his symbol itself, prefaced by his own motto here on the page: "He who does not understand should either be silent or learn." So why is this useful? I'm really only bringing this device up because it is really, for occult scholars, it's really a recognizable moniker, and supports Dee's pursuits of instances of a hermetic language, a higher vision, which he remarked about throughout in his entire library of books, a lot of times in the marginalia. Not only was he a dedicated bibliophile who traveled with his library, he used his books actually as sacred vessels. A lot of times he asks of his books for angelic direction. He was one of the greatest bibliopaths who was also inflicted with bibliomadness. But one of the reasons why we have this extensive and prolific library, which is heavily annotated, that is more actually pretty fascinating to me as a bibliographer and a cataloger than what he was actually collecting himself. By personalizing the distribution of symbols and in fact his autograph, and energetic transfer of power within his copies for his own reference. At the same time, it's a reason why the provenance became so strong. Not only because he did write his name in things, but there was an intention and subsequent value behind his inscriptions. So much so that the book thief, Nicholas Saunders, who tried to pull out books out of his library, was unsuccessful in his act of removal of his identity. Erasing name ownership is really a negation of power. It's hiding owners and it hides creators as well. So when is a name, an autograph and hidden on a flyleaf, when is that appropriate to note, say, in a catalog record? Well, in my opinion, paleography is really the key to explaining blips in time and possibly a way of us to communicate with the dead. It's a bibliographic necromancy. Who did not get the opportunity for redemption, for example? Bibliographic description, the basis of an author, date, and title. We're not just looking at it as what it is sometimes, but we look at books bibliographically as a layer of production, as a collaborative process, from the paper maker to the binder, to the book designer, to the owner. I like to think of it as book archaeology. So book plates and name inscriptions are the illuminations of that production history, that timeline of archaeology in terms of the printing history and ownership. But again, integral to the structure of the book itself as object and as this collaborative process. When you build that record up and you build that character and identity for the book as object. There's a strong case to show that book plates, as an example, are social records. There's tons of data captured in imagery and production. They're also a borrowed cache of identities, appropriation of ideas, and essentially a cult is a conglomerate of ancient and contemporary thoughts. Yet one underlying idea is that it is really protection and power redistribution. Art representing symbology in the ex libris, in the book plate, is evocation. It's the invocation of protection. And there's definitely a relative element of this transferable power. Especially in the esoteric circles of the occult revival, a lot of times these relationships were forged with book plates between the owner and the artist who forged the book plates heavily. I'm going to be talking about occult as a symbolic art form here. So Athea Biles, a book designer, designed this book plate for Lady Colin Campbell. It's a photogravure, late 19th century, and Lady Campbell, aka Gertrude Elizabeth Blood, ran in art and music circles, with Giles as well, but also with the bad boys of the occult, as you can see here, Aleister Crowley. Both were members, the women, members of the Golden Order of the Golden Dawn with W. Yeats. There's an inscription at the bottom of this bookplate, not granted to another, which is very much an allusion to that order of the Golden Dawn, but also to the collecting scope of Campbell herself. This is just an example of the link between artist and collector, and that's evident in these visual cues. There's a lot of cues about collector and symbiotic relationship between the person and the record of their protection of their property. And a lot of times you see this in Masonic owners, people who were Masons and secret societies, and also in occult authors and magicians, like Kurt Stiegelman himself. There's a specificity and a relationship between book and owner, as we will see. Another prominent person I researched in this exploration was a fairly unknown occult artist named Hugo, an esoteric graphic designer. He was born in Stuttgart, Germany, studied lithography in the Schreiber Art Institute between 1903 and 1905 in Stuttgart, where he later then moved in 1914 to Slovakia, which was formerly Pressburger. He spent most of his remaining life there, making a living as a painter and graphic artist. Although he contributed illustrations to the local Pressburger Zeitung newspaper and numerous books, his ex libris bookplates designs are really particularly noteworthy and something that I was immediately attracted to in my research. Why? Well, because they're an infusion of composition interpretation and an example of bookplates to exist as art identity themselves. Even though they're reproduced in replication with the intention of ownership, their art as art, they act alone. Despite the mystery behind Fretch himself, he was really enlightened by the esoteric, and it's really a mystery of design in his creations. And this is one of my favorite bookplates. I'm assuming this was for a family member, someone that he designed this for. There's really no evidence of his personal occult activity. He was definitely influenced by the history of his time. Unfortunately, he died on July 27, 1945, while trying to escape a camp for displaced Germans, and remains fairly unknown in the occult art world. As a comparison, Austin Osborne Spare, well-known magician, occult playboy, among other things, and artist. These book plates I'm going to show you were designed between 1904 and 1945. And so we can only surmise here about him, but another magical scholar and magician, Kenneth Grant, really puts into perspective about Spare's sigils and his artwork, his visualizations. And he says, sorcery is a deliberate act causing metamorphosis by the employment of elementals. It forges a link between the powers of middle nature, i.e. the astral plane between spiritual and physical realms, or the ether. The astrals of great trees and of animals of every kind. Will is our medium, belief is the vehicle, and the desire is the force combining with that elemental. Cryptograms are our talismans and our protectors. So he was pretty interesting, literally by his use of magic and didactic ritual. He empowered his bookplates with his magical projections. He would invoke a ritual and then do automatic drawings, and so he reproduced bookplates in this methodology. This is the last bookplate that he designed in 1945 for Planetary. He's a journalist, Dennis Martins. And interestingly, Spare around this time lost use of his arms for a while in 1945. So it's an interesting morbid personification that he's really projecting here. And it's really unusual, but not out of the ordinary for a magician like Spare. But it's this element of confrontation. He's really invoked a particular trait about his own identity, however self-absorbed that he was as a magician, and infused it graphically into the design. This is something different than we might see in mass commercialization of the bookplate, which is normally emphasized as a collector. Sparrow has really infused his own likeness here magically. His work illustrates an aggressive fusion of magic and design. What's also beginning to form is a narrative about ownership and symbolic mark. I like to think that these bookplates represent a transferable mark, analogous to the physical person, kind of like this bibliotalism, whether that's intentional or not. Like Sparrow's work, artist Hannah Coleman Smith herself referred to her visual renderings as melodious hieroglyphics, and considered that definition to be a synesthetic transmission of both sight and sound. She herself believed she had synesthesia. She wrote that she could hear and see sound. She could hear color and see sound. Because of that, her artwork is exceptional. Example of tarot on the right here, the bookplate on the left that she did not design, but you can see the influence there. There's something conventional beyond the conventional visualization, and linked, quote, for her, the desire to believe. These two, that desire and actual belief. Regardless of what Smith evolved to think about her art, it had a profound effect on later occult revival and trends in art in both styles to the 1960s modern aesthetics. Again, all her tarot designs were intentional, and in some cases to the provocative nature of art as identity. Her work, although not recognized so much later, she was early 20th century mostly, was influenced on bookplates because it exhibited the same kind of energy as the tarot, as an aspect of design. She valued a harmonic relationship, principles for composition, symmetry, subordination, opposition, transition, repetition, which led to a lot of emotional harmony within her work. Another example, bookplate and tarot, her work subconsciously, in her own words, venerated a sense of simplicity in the design and summarized the advice to, quote, find eyes within, look for the door into the unknown country. So with that in mind, Smith, still to this day, her design work is really slow to reveal and to cite. Definitely taking advantage of the public domain. It took some